The longer I stay on this site, the more I suspect I'm the only one here who knows anything about Indian history. Until the 1950s, the only Buddhist countries in the world were Tibet, Sikkim, and maybe Bhutan. As of 2016, there is only one Buddhist country in the country Bhutan, and even that's debatable. Modern versions of Buddhism have nothing in common with what the old Buddhists really practiced, save a bunch of common texts. It's the same with Hinduism as well, but to a lesser degree. In fact, save for Islam and Judaism, most religions have nothing in common with their original versions. There's nothing wrong with it. Religions that don't evolve with time are little more than excuses for barbarism. Which is why non-Abrahamic faiths are universally superior to Abrahamic ones in all aspects. First of all, readers must remember a basic point. Indic schools of thought are least bothered about the so-called ethical questions that Abrahamic faiths so obsess over. To Indic schools, it's a matter of no importance whether you fuck men or women or goats, whether you support rights for women or children or dolphins, whether you pray on Tuesday or Sunday or Star Wars Day, whether you believe in gods or demons or the flying spaghetti monster, or the thousands of questions modern society obsesses over. They had bigger fish to fry. One, what we call Buddhism, is just a blanket term for all the thousands of schools of philosophy that draw from the teachings of the Buddha, the same way Hinduism refers to the thousands of schools of philosophy that draw from the Vedas. However, we must also keep in mind that both Hinduism, as well as Buddhism, ultimately source their core views from the idea of the Brahman and the four Mahavakyas that deal with it. As such, there is very little doctrinal difference between the two broad schools of thoughts as such. Liberals, especially in India, often like to titter about the lack of casteism, women's rights, and other such fantasies they like to dream up about Buddhism. This is merely yet another bit of proof that they neither understand Buddhism nor Hinduism. To the Buddhism practiced in modern China, the Buddhism practiced in modern Sri Lanka, the Buddhism practiced in Sengoku Jidai Japan, the Buddhism being followed by Indian Ambedkarites, the Buddhism followed by Western hippies in CA, the Buddhism followed by the Oriya schools of the late classical era, and the Buddhism of Gautama Buddha are very, very different schools of thought which have barely anything in common with each other. The closest any modern school of Buddhism was to classical Buddhism was the Vajrayana of 20th century Tibet, and we know how that bit turned out. I am sure that Tibetan Buddhism will be extinct within this century, given just how many of them are converting to Christianity for the sake of missionary handouts. And even Tibetan Buddhism is based almost entirely on commentaries on the poems of late classical Oriya Buddhists, which were themselves based on the commentaries of early classical North Indian Buddhists, which were based on commentaries by pre-Mauryan Bihari Buddhists upon the Buddha's teachings. Modern hippie Buddhists hate Tibetan Buddhism because it has nothing in common with the pop culture view of Buddhism. Not one Ambedkarite Buddhist in India can tell you about the poetry of Sarapa or the philosophy of Padmasambhava, because they're all at heart Marxists who only claim to follow the Buddha because deep down they know that communism is foul and unnatural and anathema to life. Statements like, "the Buddha opposed casteism," or "Buddhists are nonviolent," are similarly nonsense. Anyone who makes such statements can be safely ignored. 3. The reason the Oriya school became so popular was because Buddhism, per se, is extremely nihilistic in nature. Modern Buddhists will refute my statements, of course, which only goes on to show how little they know of the great councils of classical India, the endless arguments and counter-arguments being made by scholars for the better part of a millennia, the terrible business with the Ajivikas, and the utter nonsense that went on during the Maurya-Gupta interregnum. Buddhism vanished from northern and western India because the Kanyakumba school consisted of a pack of murderous fanatics, similar to what we saw in northern Japan during the Sengoku Jidai. Buddhism vanished from southern India because it had been never really popular there, despite what liberals hold. The version that did survive was that based in eastern India, where it was increasingly less and less different from the core Vedantic belief system due to centuries of interpretations beginning from the days of the legendary poet Asvaghosha himself. Readers must keep in mind Asvaghosha was the preeminent commenter on 1st century Hindu thought before shifting to a more Buddhist view of thinking. Of course, readers will also keep in mind that the mere idea of converting to Buddhism or an Indic faith is nonsense of the highest order. Religious proselytization itself is an Abrahamic trait. For I observe several writers have mentioned Islamic invasions as a reason for the decline of Buddhism in India. Interestingly, more writers have gone around blasting away at Hinduism for destroying Buddhism. Some have avoided this direct route and in the typical PC fashion, tried to pin the blame on resurgent Brahmanism, whatever that means, for the decline of Buddhism. I wonder what such people will say when they come across a Buddhist worshipping Kubera or Saraswati or several of the other Vedic gods patronized by the Buddha and his later followers. Most likely such eminent folk will ignore this as revisionism by Hindu Taliban like yours truly. Crack open your copy of Jayadeva's Gita Govinda, the first great work of bhakti in the world. Sorry, I forgot that Korans are sophisticated and educated folk who disdain superstitions like Hinduism. Okay, then crack open your copy of Sarapa's Dohakosa. I'm sure at least the Ambedkarites and liberals among us have a copy of this incredible work, one that practically created Vajrayana itself. Buddha himself is believed to have told his favorite disciple Ananda that Buddha Dharma will decline after 5 centuries. But anyways, if we analyze logically, there are many reasons for the decline of Buddhism. Social reasons. Buddhism was basically centered around the concept of monkhood. One mistake Buddhists made was that they tried to make as many people monks as they could. Naturally, a life of a monk requires a lot of commitment which an average person lacks. So corruption set in the monasteries, sexual activities started happening in the monasteries, and monks and nuns started living a life of indulgence on revenues collected from several villages. This brought bad name to the Sangha. Also, these monks stayed away from villages and slowly lost connect with them. Theological reasons. Different kinds of schools of Buddhism emerged with time, and there were all kinds of deviations from the original teachings of Lord Buddha. Vajrayanism, Mahayanism and other schools developed their own set of rituals and deviated from the Ashtangika Marga as taught by Buddha. So once Buddhism also fell prey to rituals, it lost its charm and could not compete with Vedic religion. Rise of Bhagavatism. Taking cue from Buddhism and Jainism, Vedic religion underwent a number of reforms, and practices like animal sacrifices and unnecessary rituals were replaced with the rise of Bhagavatism and Bhakti movements, which stressed on personal devotion to God, selfless service, and establishing pilgrimages and festivals celebrating different deities. There was something incredibly simple yet powerful about the Bhagavatism and Shaivism that rose in different parts of India around 5th century. The Nayanars and Alwars, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Bhakti saints of Maharashtra, great Vedanta philosophers like Shankara, Ramanuja, Madhava took worship of Vishnu and Shiva and Shakti to every household. So I would argue that one reason for decline of Buddhism was their lack of faith in the divine or God. Faith in God played an important role in the life of the people of those times. People who had faith in the divine or God held onto their faith and believed in divine providence. So when Islamic persecution began, the Hindus took refuge in bhakti and devotion. This attitude might appear fatalistic, but strong faith in their religion and God did save their religion. Buddhists, however, could not hold on to their agnosticism and rationalism for too long. Most Buddhists in present-day Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh got converted to Islam. Also, rigid caste hierarchy in the Hindu society made it impenetrable and relatively less vulnerable to external attacks as compared to Buddhism, which literally collapsed in a century or two. Political reasons. The rise of Buddhism was sudden, and it is believed that even in his lifetime, Buddha had gathered a large number of followers. Later great kings like Ashoka propagated Buddha Dharma across the country and abroad. But after Ashoka and Kanishka, most powerful dynasties patronized Vedic religion more compared to Buddhism. From the Guptas to the Vakataka to Chalukyas, most were ardent champions of Vedic religion, barring a few exceptions like Harsha. Under these dynasties there was revival of Hinduism, the Puranas and epics and other oral traditions were finally compiled, various temples got constructed which became centers of learning which took Puranas and epics to every household, and also Hindu Smritis got codified. None of these things happened with Buddhism. Keen Sang tells us that most of the popular Buddhist religious places and towns were already in decline. As Buddhism was much more a urban faith than Sanatana Dharma, with the rise of feudalism under the Guptas and its cementing under Harsha, Buddhism suffered more. Also, when invading Arab and Turkish forces came, first thing they did was sack towns and cities which mainly hid Buddhism, which was already in decline. Also, many prominent educational institutions of Buddhists like Nalanda were sacked, causing irreparable loss of intellectual capital. By 12th century, Buddhism existed in only small pockets throughout the country and parts of Bengal. The Sufi saints who arrived with the Islamic Sultanate in Bengal did the rest of the job. Crisis of leadership. Leaders have been very important in the history of mankind. An Abraham Lincoln, Akbar, or a Robert Clive have single-handedly changed the fortunes of many empires and countries. Same is true with religion as well. After Nagarjuna, there was no other teacher of his stature who could arrest the decline of the Buddhism, whereas Hinduism was revitalized by great philosophers like Shankara, Ramanuja, Madhava, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Sant Ganeshwar, Tulsi Das, and various other bhakti saints of North and South India. Lack of charismatic leader led to widespread desertion from Buddhism. Man who is most credited with revival of Hinduism in the subcontinent is Adi Shankara. He was accused of being a proto-Buddhist, and it is argued that he absorbed the Buddhist doctrine of Shunyavada into his philosophy of Advaita. It was also somewhere in the early medieval times that Buddha was absorbed into the Hindu pantheon as the avatar of Vishnu. Shankara defeated various Buddhist scholars of repute in Shastrarthas and converted a lot of Buddhist back to the Sanatana Dharma. He also defeated scholars from other schools of Hindu philosophy like Nyaya, Sankhya, etc., and established the supremacy of Vedanta over others and established the four mathas and Dashanami Sampradaya. This provided the much-needed unity to the Sanatana Dharma, which it had been lacking for centuries, defined by mutual bickering. The importance of this can be gauged by the fact that when Islam entered the subcontinent, while the parts which were Hinduist held their ground, parts which were dominated by Buddhists like the present-day Sindh, Afghanistan, Bangladesh were knocked completely and were Islamist.